Hi, and welcome to Danny After Dark. If you're new here, make sure to like and subscribe so you don't miss a notification or a new episode. Tonight, I will be doing a review of the book The Velvet Hammer by Chief Judge Belvin Perry Jr. So, offhand, y'all might not recognize the judge from which this book will be discussing. However, this is the book of the judge from the Casey Anthony trial, most notably. Don't get me wrong, he has quite a career besides that one trial, but that's the one he is most known for. So this was a book that I got quite a while ago, and I'd been just putting off reading it, and finally I was like, all right, it's a quick read, so let's get to it and I can review it for you guys. So I am really excited to go over this book. So before I do that, kind of quick housekeeping things. If you are not already subscribed to the show, please do so you don't miss any episodes. All of my social media, Instagram information, Facebook, TikTok, all of the things are down below. So make sure to follow me on all of those platforms if you are not already. As a reminder as well, I did make this announcement last show, but I will do it again tonight. There will be no True Crime and Chill this Friday night. So I've told y'all it is my dance show weekend, so I will not be available the entire weekend and most of this week besides tonight leading up to show weekend. So just a reminder, no show on Friday night. But with that being said, I will be back with a show either Monday or Tuesday next week. So stay tuned and we will have something fun to go over for that, which is already in the works. And I'm really excited to go over that with you. But tune in to see what I'm talking about. So quick hello, and we will go ahead and get started. Let's see. James Watson, first one in the chat. And I love that. Yeah, I expect nothing less that you condone it. Hi, Tony Stewart. Good to see you. I have more questions than answers in my mind, but I don't want whatever your answer is to that. So we'll just go ahead and skip over. Hi, Karen Diamond. Good to see you. Hope you're doing well. Tony Stewart, Danny, I like the look. It's literally the most basic one I could have done. Los Angeles tea and curly hair. The norm. So flattery will get you everywhere, hon. All right. So as y'all know, I am a bit of a stickler in regards to the notes I do for a book. With that being said, I don't have an overtly amount of notes for this book because offhand, I will say quite a lot of it talks about the Casey Anthony trial itself. And since that is a case that we've already discussed, I've done another book review of that. I did Presumed Guilty by Jose Baez. So we already went over that book in regards to the case of the defense attorney. This is more so, I'm going to do it from the perspective, obviously, of the judge from the trial. But with that being said, a lot of this book, and I will upfront say more so than I expected, and quite frankly, more so than I would have liked, talks about the Casey Anthony case. And on the one hand, I want to give grace in that because everybody was interested in the Casey Anthony trial. So I'm not surprised that quite a large chunk of this book is devoted just to the Casey Anthony trial. With that being said, for me personally, when I was looking to read this book, I wanted more than just that because he gives a lot of just background on the case that I think I would have expected more so from, all right, here I am on the stand and here's what's being presented. Here's how I'm going through the things. But he gives almost like a crash course 101 if you had never heard of the Casey Anthony trial. So the book gives that, which on the one hand, if it's not familiar with you and you want to read this, you'll get a twofer. A lot about the judge and a lot about the trial. But if you're already familiar with the trial, I'm not going to go through the ABCs of the Casey Anthony trial. We've been there. We've done that. Y'all know. So I just want to say that up front because that was one of my main notes for the book was, I would say about 60% Casey Anthony trial and 40% about the judge and his upbringing, his career as a judge, and the aftermath of when he retired. So that's kind of the breakdown I would give. So if this is a book that you're interested in reading and you have not already, just kind of keep that in mind before you do so. So a few people came in. Just want to say hello. Kane, good to see you. Okay, let's see. So, all right, just making sure I'm caught up with everybody. Cool. All right. So the back of the book, let me go ahead and read that so y'all know what is kind of expected with this book. So after retiring from 25 years on the bench, former Chief Judge Belvin Perry Jr. reveals a rare and disturbingly vivid firsthand perspective of the most gruesome death penalty cases in which he played a key role, including the infamous Casey Marie Anthony, who was dubbed America's most hated mom after her shocking acquittal. The Velvet Hammer is the gripping true crime memoir of former Chief Judge Belvin Perry Jr., who sentenced some of Florida's most evil and notorious murderers to death, fulfilling his oath to uphold justice. Perry provides a clear, accurate description of America's criminal justice system and explains why the death penalty can and should work and how it is applied to certain capital murder cases he either prosecuted or presided over. Perry discusses his journey as an African American growing up in the segregated South, his life as a prosecutor and chief judge, and how he ended up presiding over one of the world's most intriguing capital murder trials of the century, State of Florida versus Casey Marie Anthony. From the widow who slowly poisoned her lovers to the lust murderer who mutilated his victim while she was still alive, to the serial killer who slayed a family of 4, including his own child, as well as several other violent, frightening murders. Perry spares none of the gory details when bringing each case back to life in his debut true crime memoir. So, with that being said, I will say the back cover is accurate in what the reader will get. Again, with that being said, the caveat to that, all of the other kind of examples that he gives in this book, he just gives, I'd say, brief descriptions of, maybe a few pages per each of those other cases that he's referring to. And then a bulk of the book for the Casey Anthony trial. I personally, again, when I picked up the book and read the back cover, I was like, ooh, I want to learn a lot more from the judge's perspective of all of these other cases. And I got a little of that. I just felt myself wanting more from the author from this book. But nonetheless, amazing book that I would recommend to anyone, hence why I am doing this review for y'all. So, Kat, I saw you jump in. Hello, everyone. What does your t-shirt say? It just says Los Angeles. Very simply, Los Angeles. So, nothing special. So, let's go ahead and jump in for the book. So, I did mention earlier it is an easy read. And what I mean by that is it's one of those books where you could easily sit and just kind of go through chapter by chapter and get through a large chunk of the book at once, because it's not throwing a lot at you as a reader in regards to overly technical kind of legal terms and descriptions or whatnot. With that being said, the author does give you those, but he gives them in a way that anybody reading this book would be able to understand and very easily follow. So it makes for a very easy read that you can just kind of go chapter by chapter and kind of knock out a bunch if that's your thing, which y'all know I will just sit and crush a book in one sitting. So easy to do with this. It is 336 pages. There are no pictures at all. Not on the front cover, not even on the back cover. No pictures. With that being said, I was glad not to see a single picture of Casey Anthony in this book. I would have liked, however, to maybe have seen some of Chief Judge Belvin Perry. in regards to him growing up or him on the bench. I would have liked that just because it is his memoir. But to get those types of photos, I had to go to the internet to be able to see that, which I just would have liked some in the book. But that's just me and what I kind of would have liked. But other than that, no pictures in the book. So, Chapter 1. So the book starts right away in how Chief Judge Belvin Perry became the first African-American elected to the bench of the 9th Judicial Court Circuit of Orlando, Florida. And that is without being first appointed in 1989. And that was a big deal back then for him. And the book kind of goes into why and the difference in somebody being appointed for that position versus not appointed. His fellow judges chose him to become the chief judge in 1995 from there. And he held this position for almost 20 years before he retired on August 31st, 2014. He says, quote, "During my time on the bench, I sentenced each of Florida's most evil, notorious murderers to death, fulfilling my oath to follow the law. The vicious and calculated killing of another human being is the worst kind of crime that can warrant the punishment of execution," end quote. Before becoming a judge, however, he worked at the office of the state attorney as the prosecutor, and he did that for about 12 years. And that was where he saw the death penalty for many of the murder cases that he tried. So right in the first chapter of the book, he goes ahead and explains to the reader why the death penalty is effective and how it is applied in certain murder cases. With that being said, if somebody is reading this book and they are anti-death penalty, it would not turn you off as a reader because he's not saying, here's why it has to happen and here's why you should think this way. It is not like that at all. It is from where I practice law, here is why certain people cannot be redeemed and need to be, up for the death penalty. And he does a really, really great job of making sure that the reader, regardless of what you believe, everybody will be able to read that and say, okay, I can follow where he's going with this. I might not personally agree, or maybe I do agree, but I follow where he's going with this. So what he says is, quote, "There are certain evil people in this world who cannot be redeemed, and the death penalty is the proper punishment under Florida law," end quote. He also goes on to say, quote, "Now that I have stepped down from the bench, it is time I tell you from my perspective what really happened in each case. I am Belvin Perry Jr. This is my story," end quote. So right away after the end of chapter 1, you were like, all right, here we go. So the Casey Anthony murder, he kind of starts with little crumbs of the case, but it doesn't dive into it fully until later on in the book, but which I would have just liked it for it to just be said at the end and then kind of go through everything else. But I get it how people are like, okay, this was the judge from the Casey Anthony trial. So they kind of probably want to dive into something or get pieces of that initially. So he does give, again, what I would say is little crumbs of that case, goes through other things, and then picks back up on it towards the end. But what he says about the Casey Anthony trial is it was televised, and Twitter was the one that gave the moniker for him of the Velvet Hammer. He says, quote, "The Velvet Hammer was fitting because I had a smooth level of ease as a judge, while also being firm and holding folks to the rules. I never shrunk from a challenge when I was forced to come down hard with a hammer," end quote. And as he goes on to discuss his career, I do feel that that description of him was very spot on. And as he was going through some of the other cases in this book, of course, I wanted to kind of go down a little bit of each of those rabbit holes in regard to those cases, just to get a bit more information that was not discussed in the book. And when I was reading through those and kind of how those trials went, I was like, okay, I can really see how he presided in not just the Casey Anthony trial for what we know him for, but all of these other cases as well. So he reviews in detail with examples the difference between an aggravating factor and a mitigating factor in regards to court. So leading to the point that the death penalty is reserved again for the most aggravated and least mitigated factors. However, in any criminal case where the defendant has been found guilty, the judge must look at both factors while considering their sentence. So one thing to keep in mind while reading this book, and it was something I had to really try to not have a preconceived notion in the back of my mind, is yes, he was a judge in Florida. And I know right off the bat, a lot of you are thinking, like, there are so many Florida cases that are so notorious, whether the death penalty was used in sentencing or not. And it's one of those things, we're listening to true crime podcasts. Anytime something is referenced in Florida, it's one of those like, almost like, oh, well, of course, type of sighs and reactions. So I really tried, honestly, to the best of my ability, to just put that out of my mind so that when I was reading his book, it was from the most judgment-free perspective that I could give it in regards to that. Because let's be perfectly honest, anytime it's like, oh, Florida case, we're like, here we go again. So let's keep that in mind. So we get a little bit of a history in regards to Judge Belvin Perry Jr., as he said in the back of the book, in regards to growing up as an African American during segregation. He used the tough cop attitude that was bestowed upon him by his late father. His father was actually one of the first African Americans to become a policeman in Orlando, Florida. And that, again, was a big deal at that time. And he does go into detail about that more in this book in regards to why that was a big deal and his father's job in kind of what he did during that time, because it's just so different than what most of the United States was kind of where they were at that time in history. So this is a big part of what inspired him to become a judge when his father started taking him to city court with him during his elementary school years, which, how cool and what a unique experience that was for Belvin Perry Jr. to be able to have that kind of, do you guys remember those, kind of shadow your parents at work day type of thing? To be able to do that from such a young age for Belvin, like, is just incredible. And he does talk a little bit about that as a child, kind of going to court in some of the things that he would see, which you don't as a child pick up quite the small details and the meanings behind what is truly happening at that time. You're just seeing things through a childhood lens, if you will. But that did mold him really impactfully into what would become his career. So on December 1st, 1977, Belvin started practicing law. He then goes through several of the cases that he personally was the one that sentenced them to death. And I'll just give those names in here. We won't go through each of them during this show, but I will say it does go through them, about several pages per case in this book. Elmer Leon Carroll, Dusty Rice Spencer, Judy Goodyear, Thomas Godinez, Scott Mansfield, John Huggins, and Jermaine LeBron. He says, quote, "There are remarkable things I've accomplished beyond Casey Anthony that I would like to be remembered for. However, regardless of those accomplishments, I know that most of the United States of America, actually most of the world, will always remember me as the judge who covered the murder trial," end quote. And that is, I honestly just felt so sad in that moment, because when you get to that point in the book, he's discussed so much of his career that got him to the place where he was when the Casey Anthony trial was going to be then bestowed upon him. And he had such a resume of a career that you could write a book about so many aspects of his life. But I also see where he's coming from, that it's like, at the end of the day, no one really knows, or I hate to say cares, because that sounds so cruel and callous, but at the end of the day, people are like, that's the judge from the Casey Anthony trial. Nothing else. They're looking nothing else at what he's done in his career. It's just that was the judge in the Casey Anthony trial. And I just felt really sad for him in that moment reading that, because he's right. And it's just sad because he's done so much more than that. So for most people outside of the legal community, the Casey Anthony trial was probably the first time that he realizes people had heard of him. Again, he had all these other cases where he did sentence people to death in those really extreme, brutal, violent cases. But his name didn't pick up as much traction as it did. And then came the Casey Anthony trial. He then goes on to discuss the Casey Anthony case. And again, we will not get terribly into that because that's a lot of the stuff we know. What I will go over is kind of his kind of overlooking things from the bench. So before we jump into that, I also want to see where you guys are in the chat. No pictures, forget it. Oh, come on, Kane. So back to Belvin himself. He was born October 11th, 1949. And again, so growing up, not only did he become interested in the law field, kind of looking as up to his father in that way, but he also took an interest in history and spent a lot of time at the local library reading books. He talks about an accident that he had at 6 years old. He was at a neighbor's house having what was a pretend sword fight with butcher knives. Y'all. He says, quote, "I should have zigged when I zagged and the knife went straight into my right eye." End quote. So the doctors had to remove that eye and he was ultimately given a prosthetic replacement. And since then, he has been half blind. But looking at pictures of him, you never would know that. You just would have no clue. You really have to look and then you're like, I guess, but it's not visible to the average person just looking at his photo. So sadly, in 1957, growing up, his mother had just walked away from the family. And now it was his father's role to raise him and his sisters as a single parent. He remembers that, and it's so sad, he watched his mom leave from the front porch, not knowing that would be the last time that he would see her for many, many years. So his father and grandmother made sure that Belvin and his sisters were always well taken care of. His mom sadly passed away in the 1980s. But before that, they did have a time when they did visit. He later learned that she suffered from schizophrenia, and that would have been the cause of why she left and explained so much of her behavior before she had passed away. Kind of, again, hindsight's always 20/20, right? So Belvin and one of his sisters moved in with an older woman known as Mama Essie, and that was someone that his father had found. His father had lived close by and was always a presence at Mama Essie's home. This was a very positive experience for Belvin, but it also forced him to mature very quickly. There were always chores, structure, and routine. And he says that over and over again. He was also very involved in the church. His father then married a woman while he was in 6th grade, and she was a wonderful woman who treated him and his sisters like they were her own biological children. Sadly, she actually just recently passed away in 2023. So Belvin talks about segregation while growing up and how it impacted not only his community, but also him and his family directly. So now we get to a little bit more of the cases in the book. I listed those examples earlier, but besides those, there are other examples that are mentioned in the book where maybe these cases get like a paragraph or two. I actually found each one of those very interesting, particularly this first one. So I will say I did kind of, as I was reading, pause to kind of go down each of these little rabbit holes to be like, I want to know a little bit more about each of these cases, because I just found just the brief descriptions he gives the reader so incredibly fascinating. So one of them was the execution of the Black Widow, Judy Goodyear. That was a case that he prosecuted. And he talks about he went to watch her being executed. And he goes through that process with the reader, which I found that absolutely fascinating, because he makes it very clear, like, I did not want to be there. This was not something that I was interested in doing, but because of what he did for a living, in certain cases, it made sense that he be there for those executions because they were cases that he tried. So he talks about another case. Let's see, which then dives into kind of a brief intro into how he got started with his journey as at the state attorney's office. And I know that kind of sounds kind of weird as I just said it, but kind of follow me here. So in 1974, he went to Houston, Texas, because he was going to the Thurgood Marshall School of Law at Texas Southern University. That is a mouthful. And he was given good advice in regards to how to succeed in law school and pass the bar exam the very first time. He goes through all of that, and where a lot of his other classmates didn't, he followed that advice super strictly. And what he would say is throughout law school, he built more of a kind of not just professional relationship with his professors, but also a personal relationship with them. He really loved school and took advantage of every opportunity and we would call that more now like networking type of relationship, but he just had that hunger and that drive, and it was very clear that his professors saw that in him as well. So during his third year of law school, one of his professors actually offered him a job. So that job was to draft briefs and write appeals. So he was able to do that. He was then offered a position in the private practice, but he turned it down because he wanted to go back home to Orlando. He then graduated in May 1977, returned back home after that, and he dreamt of becoming a successful personal injury lawyer. He sent out resumes, copies of his transcripts to every law firm in Orlando. That was so Boston right now. Every law firm in Orlando. No one was interested. He learned that unless he graduated from Harvard or Yale, no law firms at that time would be interested in not just him, but just any attorney that was kind of seeking a job at that point in their beginning of the career, to be perfectly honest. So the advice that he was given at that point was to get a job with legal aid or the public defender's office. So what he thought of was moving back to Houston, Texas, and seeing if that professor that originally had given him that job while he was in school might still extend an offer for a job. So, however, that was declined. So Belvin's father had a contact at the state attorney's office, a man named Robert Egan, and his father linked him with Robert Egan. So Belvin met with Mr. Egan, and he didn't have an opening at his law firm at that moment, but said, when I have one, you will be the first person that I contact. And within a few months, come November, he got that call. And Robert Egan said, report to work on December 1st. So on December 1st, 1977, Belvin reported for work as an assistant state attorney in the traffic division court. He, at that time, was the only assistant state attorney who was Black. Again, very different times and a big deal at that time. That is when we learned about the case of Joseph Martyr. So if anybody is interested in learning more about who he is, make note of that and go down that rabbit hole just like I did. So we then learn about another case, Jerry William Correll, and that is a very interesting one. Again, we'll put a pin in that and check that out if that was one you wanted to also learn more about. That's the thing with this book is, again, there are some cases that the author goes in detail about, as we talked about earlier in the show. And then there are some where he just kind of will reference a name of a case that he worked and just kind of a paragraph or so. And you read that paragraph and you're like, no, I want more. Like, this case sounds fascinating. But the author doesn't give you that, which on the one hand, I'm like, okay, the book is already 336 pages. So it's I would consider that a pretty decently long book. But with that being said, if he was going to go into detail of all these other cases, I mean, this book could be easily 700-800 pages if he did the same type of kind of description that he kind of gave the casing that he won. But again, that's just kind of my personal note, is I would have liked a little bit more of these other cases. But nonetheless, I was able to get the names, get a brief description, and be like, oh, okay, that is one that I do want to learn a little bit more about, and then be able to go down that research rabbit hole. So back to Chief Judge. So he talked about how he graduated from law school when he was, and here's the thing, we talked about earlier how and why he felt death penalty cases should apply to certain people. He was not in favor of the death penalty when he graduated from law school, like very much not in favor of it, which is so interesting because that he gives that sentence and you're, as a reader, you pause and you're like, wait a minute. He has talked about leading up to this point, how the death penalty case, depending on, the severity of the crime, like the death penalty option is so important because there are certain people that cannot be rehabilitated. And then he just kind of says, I wasn't in favor of it. So you get that pause as a reader, and then he goes to explain why that is. And then as the book progresses, you get what kind of led him to change his viewpoint. And I found that angle of him very fascinating as the book kind of progressed. So he goes on to describe, at this point in the book, as a prosecutor, he saw the devastating effects and impacts that murder had on the victims and the victims' loved ones. He also saw many cases involving premeditated murders and how the perpetrator made the victims suffer a great deal before killing them. After seeing these horrific crimes, he started to believe that the death penalty was appropriate in certain cases to seek justice for the victims and their grieving loved ones. Quote, the death penalty is not for every murderer. The state of Florida reserves it for the worst of the worst, and particularly for those atrocious homicides where victims felt impending doom, terror, and pain. End quote. The electric chair in Florida, as most of us know, is known as Old Sparky. It was the sole means of execution in Florida since 1924. The problem with it, as he goes on to describe in the book, is that from time to time, the convict caught on fire while being executed. This caused the United States Supreme Court to rule on whether the use of the electric chair as a sole method of execution in Florida violated the inmate's Eighth Amendment right, which means to not have cruel and unusual punishment. So keep that in mind as the book progresses. So the book then goes on to list several more examples of killers, but 3 particular killers who actually caught on fire while they were being executed. Jesse Joseph Tefero, Pedro Luis Medina, and Alan Lee Davis. So Florida then determined by the Supreme Court that electrocution was not a form of cruel and unusual punishment. The original electric chair, however, was replaced with an updated one, and lethal injection was introduced as an alternative death penalty option. So we get back to Belvin. So the book kind of, as the book goes on, it kind of jumps back and forth in time from him kind of growing up to different points in his career, then jumping back to a later time of him growing up, and then jumping forward again to a later time in his career. So y'all know I'm not a fan of that. Y'all know I am not a fan of that writing style. I will say he does do one of the better jobs of it than I have seen in most books. So to give credit where credit is due. So with that being said, we're going to be jumping back a moment now. So Belvin looks over his first paying job the summer before sophomore year of high school. And this is formative for him. He was on the back of a garbage truck collecting trash bins. And then he was in a youth program digging holes for tall, oversized palm trees to be planted. He looks back at this point in his life and he realizes the values that those basic jobs that he had instilled in him. And those are a lot of the traits that he kept up with during his education, his early career, and just honestly throughout his entire life and career. And he feels that is ultimately what really led to him being a successful, prosecution attorney, judge, and chief justice. It wasn't until 21 years old when he began joining his father for a beer from time to time and sitting and opening up in dialogue. And again, we all know the career that his dad had. So imagine the type of just end of the day, crack open a drink conversation with somebody who's working the type of career that his father had. Like, I can't even imagine the types of conversations, like, how was your day today, Dad? Type of things, right? So it was one of those times that they were, having a drink together and discussing life. He was just finishing law school and his father began opening up actually about the ugliness, the racial discrimination, and the harassment that he endured while being in the police force. This was, again, at a big time in regards to segregation in the United States. And Belvin just talks about how impactful and eye-opening that conversation was with his father, because it's very clear that his father, I don't want to say shielded him and his siblings from that, but really, he was a police officer who just went and did his job. And kind of, there are some people when they get home at the end of the day, they just kind of disassociate and they're like, all right, leaving the job at the door, I'm home with my family now. And it's very kind of clear that his father was that person, so that he wasn't taking all of that baggage from work home with him to then kind of either advertently or inadvertently kind of project onto his family and his children. So the book goes on to discuss all of the specific things that his father endured. And it was just heartbreaking, like absolutely heartbreaking. So his father taught him and his siblings that hard work and sacrifice will always reward you. Quote, "My father took adversity as an opportunity to succeed," end quote. So we get to a point in the book where the chapter is actually called Becoming Judge Belvin Perry Jr. He explained how he applied for the bench 7 times and he was not appointed any of those times. This is because he made too many enemies in the legal community because of his reputation as a no-nonsense prosecutor. So there was one case in particular that he discusses, and it involved prosecuting a young man named Kirk Hansbrough. And that case, he gets into detail about it, but it also really held him back from being appointed, which is just, it's horrible because you read about, like, again, how he's very fair, no nonsense, and you're going to make enemies because you're not going to bend the rules. And we see that not just in careers like this. We see that everywhere. I guarantee all of y'all, we all have stories like that, right? So this would be no different. This field would be no different. So finally, he decided to run for judge. And in 1989, he finally won an election. And in 1995, he was encouraged to run for chief judge. He felt he was still too new, but he was encouraged by his other judges to do so. And in 2007, he finally became chief judge. So he served 9 terms as chief judge, and he still holds the title of the longest serving chief judge because the rules changed after he retired. So that's kind of cool, right? So one of the very first defendants that he had sentenced to death was Dusty Spencer. In the book, we talked about that name a little bit earlier. It reviews that case. Another high profile case where if you're thinking, wait a minute, Danny, I know this judge's name from somewhere else. Where do I know it? The George Zimmerman case. Yes, he was the judge in that case. And the book does go into that. And it goes into that actually a pretty decent amount. I'm not going to review that because that is a case that we all know. But yeah, he was involved in that case. As I mentioned earlier, the name Scott Mansfield, the book gets into that case as well. So once the book goes through all of those other cases, then it gets to finally the infamous trial of Casey Anthony. And that is chapter 12 in the book. So from chapter 12 on is when the book is pretty much devoted to Casey Anthony. Let me just double check. So technically chapters 12, 13, and 14 are really just Casey Anthony, which if you're thinking, wait, Danny, that was only 3 chapters. But it covers, let's see, from page 160 to 336. So it covers a lot. Those 3 chapters alone are very long chapters. And again, specifically about the Casey Anthony trial. So kind of keep that in mind. But we will briefly go into things as I cover this part and kind of my thoughts on it. Because I actually do have quite a bit of thoughts on the author's take on this case. So this section starts out right away with Kaylee missing. The judge then goes into Casey Anthony herself and her background. And right away, the judge does not hold back in regards to Casey being pregnant and her family not, like, very much in denial. Like, she was very much showing very obviously pregnant, where even other family members are like, oh, what's going on? Casey's pregnant. And mom and dad like, no, she's just puffy, so on and so forth, right? But also the judge Casey lied to her family, not only about that, but about everything. So right away in the book, the judge is like, Casey lied about everything, and we're going to talk about it as every example unfolds. So Casey, in regards to the father of Kaylee, we learned that she would just name so many different guys as the potential fathers and just kind of go from one person to the next to the next. The book goes quite a bit also into George Anthony, and I understand why, because he became such a central point of the trial. So I do like that the author gave a lot of background information about George and his role in the Anthony family, because it's going to come up in detail later in the book, and you kind of get all of that knowledge firsthand, so that once it comes up in trial, you're like, oh, I can see why that did. So he talks about George again in regards to his gambling addictions. He would rack up credit cards, cashing in $60,000 in workers' comp settlements checks, cashing in his retirement account, and not paying taxes. His wife, Cindy Anthony, then had to find out and foot the bill. So, and that happened all the time. And now, because George cashed in all of those things, they were not able to pay off their home. So right away in the beginning of the Casey Anthony chapters, not only is he setting you up for in regards to Casey Anthony as a person, but George and Cindy. So it more so starts about George, and this then goes into Cindy. So in regards for Casey's delivery when she got pregnant and then had her baby Kaylee, George and Cindy were in the room. Lee, her brother, Casey's brother, did not want to go. He had feelings about Casey that weren't positive, and he was honestly very mad at his parents for always lying for Casey. So the birth, the judge is just like, yeah, here's what happened. Not only during the birth with her parents in the room, but like her father, George, right there, front row, center for the birth, in a role where it's like, yeah, very awkward for a father to be in to watch his daughter give. It was just, yeah, but which I feel like some people might be like, well, wait a minute, that's not uncommon and whatnot. But when you like put together all the pieces of the Anthony family, it's just alone wouldn't be much. But when you add it to the puzzle, again, there are a lot of those pieces that make a puzzle. So there that is. So there was one guy, Jesse. He was the main one that Casey kept saying, he's the father, even though the math of when they had sex and when she would have conceived didn't really add up. It didn't matter. Jesse met Kaylee after she was born. He wanted to take a paternity test, though. At the end, he's like, I will still love this child. I just want to know. Casey was livid, pushed. And finally, Casey did allow for a test. And wouldn't you know, the math didn't math. Jesse was not the father of Kaylee, but he still loved that child at the end of the day. So props to Jesse for that, especially for dealing with Casey during this time. But I mean, so many opportunities you would hear this and just say Jesse could have bounced. And no, he loved that child, even though it was not his child. So for the first 2 years of Kaylee's life, she and Casey lived with the Anthonys, as we know, because really Casey didn't have anywhere else to go. She had, while living at her parents' home, no rent, no bills to pay. Cindy and George paid for everything for Casey, but more importantly for Kaylee. So right away as well, the judge really goes into this is where a lot of resentments really started to occur. And Casey was having resentment of Kaylee because now Kaylee was getting the attention from George and Cindy and not her. So Casey started rebelling. In 2005, Jesse proposed to Casey and she said yes. The thing is that Jesse couldn't move into the Anthony's home and Casey couldn't move into Jesse's home because they each still lived with their parents. So this is where the point in the book that a lot of us are kind of aware of from the trial. But before I get to that, hey, Wolf, I saw you pop in. Hope you're doing well. I wonder what really happened to Kaylee. We get from the judge what he thinks. So we will get to that. But do any of us have an answer? No, because I'm not like, disclaimer in regards to like, if you don't know this trial, like, I don't want to give it away. The state and the prosecution never really presented, here's what happened. So there's that, which is like, you brought that trial. But we will get into that. The judge talks about his feelings on all of that in this book. So one of the big things that we learned during the trial was that, again, Casey would lie. She would lie to family. She would lie to friends about working at Universal Studios and also a job at Sports Authority. So Casey, every single day, would drop off Kaylee with one of her friends, Lauren, to babysit while she worked. Casey at this time also broke up with Jesse. And the reason she broke up with Jesse, because he loved Kaylee more than her. So Casey's friends, one by one, would catch her in these long-term lies and would eventually distance themselves from her. So one by one, she was losing her friends. Lauren, the girl I just mentioned, who babysat Kaylee almost every single day for a long time, one day actually called Sports Authority and was told by them, quote, she has never worked here, end quote, in regards to Casey. Imagine Lauren like being what she thinks is a good friend and babysitting Kaylee day after day after day for a long time while your friend is at work. And she never worked there. So Lauren confronted Casey, and Casey lied and said, "Oh, I do work there. It's just a miscommunication issue." Like, she held on to it. George decided one day that he was going to drive to Sports Authority and actually bring his daughter Casey lunch. When he got there with lunch for his daughter, he was told she does not work here, nor has she ever worked here. So when George went back home and told Cindy, his wife, about this, Cindy actually got mad at George and said, if Casey finds out that you did that and that you know she doesn't work there, she's going to be irritated at you. And I think we all need to have that pause right now. The what the fuck pause, because any rational person is thinking, wait a minute, why is Cindy mad at George? Where Casey's going to be irritated that George discovered that for all these years she's been saying we haven't even got to the Disney World lie yet. Let's keep that in mind. We know that's going to be coming. We haven't got there yet. This is just the Sports Authority job. So what is the bottom line? Cindy was always covering for Casey. She was just caught in such a big lie, and Cindy is mad at George. So, right? The book doesn't terribly get into that, nor did it get into that a ton during the trial. I mean, we know that she partied, but it doesn't really address specifically, James, to your question, she would go to the beach every day or she went shopping. The book doesn't give that. It just is general being without her kid. I wish I had that answer, and I'm sure a lot of people would have liked to have known that answer. So, James, that actually is an excellent question. But no, the book doesn't say specifically here's what she was doing every day. It gives sometimes oh, she was out with her boyfriend or out doing this or out doing that, but it wasn't this is what she consistently did every day. I ain't gonna deny what you're saying is wrong. Some of that played out on television, her and her fake. Yeah. But again, this is just the Sports Authority job, not even Disney. So in regards to her lying and manipulating behavior, you see points where it's why wasn't that addressed then? Why was it just brushed under the carpet? Again and again and again and again. And that's what we got at the trial, right? All of these things laid out, but nonetheless, we're just kind of going in order here, right? So the book, in regards to after all of these lies with Casey, then goes into when Kaylee goes missing. And this is really where the author of the book really goes into a lot of detail from that perspective of, okay, day one. And when I say day one, meaning that 911 call from the Anthonys and kind of what started everything is then police then learn that 31 days has gone by since Kaylee has been missing, and what has Casey been doing for those 31 days. So the book gets into that in quite a bit of detail. I will say one of my notes for this book, and it's not a positive one. So the author will make notation at the bottom of each page if he's pulling the information from another source. And a big source that he uses is the book that I've reviewed on this channel with you guys, is Presumed Guilty by Jose Baez. Again, Jose Baez was Casey Anthony's defense attorney. When I first started noticing a lot of the sightings from this book in regards to giving like, here's where he got the information. Like, a few things I was like, okay, that makes sense. But then I'm like, as we're reading, I'm like, he is citing this book a lot. And to the point where I'm thinking, like, wait a minute. Like, I don't want Jose Baez's book again. I've already read it. I have it. It's right over there. We've talked about it. We have his perspective. I want your perspective. So if Jose is arguing something, I don't need necessarily that citation from Jose's book with his perspective. I want your perspective as the judge. And I just felt as these 3 chapters went on, I was like, oh my God, he's citing this book again and again and again. And I didn't want that. As the reader, I did not want that. Because if that's the case, I would just have gone with Jose Baez's book and not have picked up this book. So that was, like, honestly, my only, like, real nerving part of this book, my real negative part about it. And it weighed quite a bit in these 3 chapters. I'm not going to lie. I still liked the book. I still recommend this book to everybody. But that was one where I'm just like, I wish you didn't do that. I just wanted more from you. So now that I have that rant over, let's get back to it. So again, the author goes into great detail of that first 911 phone call from the Anthonys. And then they learn this child, Kaylee, has been missing for 31 days. And her mother, Casey, has not reported it. And again, we're not going to get into the nitty gritty here. We already know that. So again, my notes are a lot of details and conversations between the family, the Anthonys, that was put into this book once they realize Kaylee is missing. In regard to the death penalty and how it relates to this case, the author describes it was basically when it was presented that the state was going to seek the death penalty. The author's perspective, and I liked the way he described this, as it was basically slinging mud against the wall over and over, more and more, that there was mud on the wall. So finally it was like, okay, yes, this can finally, we have enough that it can be a death penalty case. So I thought that was very interesting from his perspective as the judge, for him to view how that metaphor of how that happened. I found that absolutely fascinating. So, okay, all right. I think it's going to explain a lot of the tone going forward in the book. So the judge goes on to say that there were 600,000 cases that year alone in his circuit court. And he had other judges reporting to him. In fact, 64 judges reporting to him. So Chief Judge Belvin Perry Jr., make no mistake, he knows what he's doing. He runs a tight ship with his court. Again, 600,000 cases alone and 64 judges report to him. So now the judge then goes on to talk about, because we're not going to get into the background of everything with Casey Anthony, but now we get to the point of jury selection in the book. And the judge talks about that and the importance of jury selection in a trial like this. And right away, he talks about there were several people who were just blatantly disobeying the judge's orders, and they were held in contempt. And he goes into example for those. And it's just like, some people were a little bit more reserved about it, but there were others who were just blatantly disregarding what the judge said. Like, clearly, like, I'm just going to put it out there that I don't give a shit what you say. What are you going to do? And he's like, this judge, he does not play. He does not play. He holds them in contempt. And one of the things that you guys honestly will love about this book is when he holds people in contempt in regards to this case, when he brings them in front of him to speak about this, he puts verbatim in the book how that conversation goes. And oh my gosh, it is I would love to have seen these in person because he's very polite, but he's going to make you look bad, as you should. And he just asks the questions, the basic questions. And the people that, again, who are brought in front of him think they can weasel their way out of the answers. Like, oh, well, I didn't know. And he's like, oh, no. Explain this. Explain that. So almost like, I'm sure everybody who sat in that courtroom was like pained listening to it, but like he makes an example. He does not yell. He does not raise his voice. He does not call them out of their name. He just knows how to effectively make an example. And it's each time there's someone that's held in contempt and that part comes in the book, I'm like, ooh, I love this. It's so juicy. Like, love that part. Love that. I would have loved to just sit in his courtroom and watch person after person just get dragged by him in the most respectful way. So that's actually, again, one of the points that I wanted to say was one of my favorite parts of this book is like when he would do that. All right, but let's get back. So finally, the jury is selected. The trial begins. And he says when the defense opened and they shocked everyone, and the judge says he was shocked himself, like completely taken aback. He did not expect this. And what I'll say is, when the defense opened their arguments, they said, Casey Anthony did not go to the police for 31 days when Kaylee was missing because Kaylee was never missing. She died on June 16th, 2008, when she drowned in the family's swimming pool. And Casey was raised to lie. So right away, like, I like how the judge says, like, everybody in the courtroom was shocked. The prosecution was shocked. The jury was shocked. I was shocked. Like, I love that he just, again, that type of description from the trial is what I wanted throughout the entire Casey Anthony part. And I wish we as the reader got more of that. But like when those moments happen and you're reading it, you're like, oh my God. All right. And another example that the judge talks about that was just shocking is, disclaimer, y'all, just, he talks about, he is in Jose Baez for the defense, talks about, Casey was raised to lie, right? At 13, if y'all want to bounce up for 10 seconds, at 13 years old, she would have her father's penis in her mouth, and then she would go to school and play with the other kids, just like nothing happened. And the judge is like, I can't believe that the defense just said that. Like, everybody was stunned. But the defense is setting the precedent of right away, like, she was raised to lie, and to pretend that in moments like that, everything's normal. Everything's fine. So they're, again, planting those defense. They're doing their job of planting the seeds, right? So the defense also says George was the one that fished out Kaylee's lifeless body from the pool, and that Roy Kronk, reminder, he was the one who found Kaylee's body, was actually really the one who hid Kaylee's body and then tried to call and get the reward money. And I know people have a lot of mixed feelings about Roy Kronk. He's not the most well-liked person for a variety of reasons, but at the end of the day, he was dragged in this trial. Some people believe maybe he did know more than he said. Regardless, he was dragged. So prosecutors, they did not show, and this is one of the things that the judge says, is the prosecutors, they did not show and they did not explain to the jury how Kaylee died. And that was a big deal because he says the prosecution was kind of going in and was like, here's what we have. But he points out Jose Baez knew this and he was well prepared. And when a case is based on circumstantial evidence, the state must respond to those theories. But he makes it clear that they did not make those adjustments to appeal to the jury. And let me give another example. A lot of us watched this trial, so we know how this played out, right? But the defense, and I will say, the defense was always ready. They had their game plan. But if something was said or something happened, to give credit where credit is due, Jose Baez and his team was very good at, I'll say, pivoting. So they knew the road they had to do. They know they had the reasonable doubt that they had to plant to show why their client should be found not guilty. But they were able to pivot along the way. Sometimes just once, sometimes more than once. Sometimes they do a full damn circle, but they were prepared to pivot at all times. Where the state and the prosecution didn't do that. It was, here's the path we're going to present. Yes, there's cross-exam and Jose's bringing up X, Y, and Z, but we're not going to address that. We're just going to keep going on our path. And the judge was very clear, like, they did not make adjustments that would appeal to the jury. Like, the judge doesn't say they dropped the ball, but his wording around this part of the book makes it very clear that, like, Jose Baez and his team were ready. They were ready and prepared to respond to whatever that was thrown at them, where the state wasn't. So as I mentioned earlier, and again, for anybody who watched this trial or has read about this, y'all know, George Anthony Casey's father. So he was dragged by the defense when he was on the stand. And the judge in this book kind of goes through a lot of the not only, questioning that he got from the state, because when he was on the stand, but a lot of what happened during cross-exam. And the state did not help him. They did not. Jose and his team knew, like, at the end of the day, we all have our feelings about Casey Anthony, right? Trust me, I am right there with all of you. I am right there with you. With that being said, Jose Baez, the defense, had a job to do for their client, and they fucking did it. And they dragged George, and the state just let it happen. They did not try to save him or save his credibility in any way, shape, or form. And if you're thinking, well, Danny, what was there to save? What was there any credibility to give back? Heard? I see you. I hear you. But they had a job to do. The state had a job to do. And they just, again, they didn't pivot when they needed to pivot. It's like where the defense was like, we're going to take you from the jury down this road of George and put reasonable doubt. And the state was just like, we're just going to stay in our lane. And it just didn't work well. But there's that. So, all right, this part in the book was very, very interesting. It was a part about the judge saying there was a part of how Casey Anthony would present herself to the media, to the cameras, to those in court, but most importantly, to the jury. If the jury was not in the room, she was very, very different than when they entered. And he goes into that in detail. And that was actually one of my favorite parts of this book as well. From his perspective as the judge is kind of watching this unfold. And he would say, here's what I'm seeing when the jury's there. Here's what I'm seeing when she's not. Here's what she's saying when the jury's here. Here's what she's saying when they're not. And it was just, wow. So one of the examples that he gives is there was a point where Casey was offered a plea deal and she refused. She says, I'm not guilty, so I'm not going to take it. I'm an innocent person. The defense, again, and it's their job to run that plea deal by their client. So one of the defense attorneys, not Jose Baez, but a different one on the team, said, she might not be getting it, that we need to really just say, here's what's on the table. Think before you just, whatnot. So the judge said, okay, I'll allow you to discuss this with your client in private outside of the jury. And the judge says, suddenly he heard Casey shouting 4-letter curse words from her holding cell. And one of the attorneys on the defense team said, I actually questioned Casey's competency. So the judge says, by law, when there are questions about competency, the court has to take it seriously and has to temporarily stop the trial for an examination to be conducted on the defendant. And this is a big, big deal, because if something happens on appeal and the judge just let it go, so on and so forth, not okay. So the judge says, I right then and there stopped court for the day and got her evaluated. And it only took I think 1.5 days. And we hear, quote, the reports found Casey competent to stand trial, end quote. So one of the quotes that I really liked about this section of the book, quote, in front of jurors, Casey was quiet and shy, like a shrinking violet, portraying the role of a wrongfully accused, grieving mother. Without jurors present, I noticed change in transformation in Casey. No more shrinking violet. She was in charge and scolded her attorneys. I call this the two faces of Casey Anthony. It was evident she knew how to fool the audience watching her every move, end quote. Isn't that just such an impactful quote from the author? I think that's just sums it right up, right? And again, he just has to sit there and, that's not so disrespectful, but oversee everything and rule, professionally for both sides. And one of the things that the author goes on to discuss is, as we know, during this case, there was a lot of objections that would be brought up, not just by the defense, but also by the state. And some of the big ones, the author discusses in detail in this book, and he gives context to each one. So there are some that I think sometimes a reader might say, oh, I remember that the judge should have tossed that, or he should have allowed that in when he, or whatnot. And he gets into each of those details. And each of those things he either left out in why or let in why. And he cites case law as to, here's the things I had to look at when making the decision on this specific thing. And he mentions the specific case laws he had to mention in order to, again, either include or exclude something, and the implications that would happen if he just chose to be like, oh, well, case law says this, but it could have huge impacts, not just for Casey's potential appeal, but also for other cases then going forward. Because if now someone comes up for something similar or whatnot, his ruling could then be cited in case law for somebody else going forward. So he really has to weigh a lot out. And from the perspective of him for that, not just for the examples that he gives in this case, it's just, you really see okay, so this is the type of thought, behind the scenes thought that somebody watching a trial just doesn't get into how he's making each ruling that he does. But again, for the reader, he gives the specific things of when the defense wanted to include this or exclude this. So he gives those specific examples for a lot of things in this case, which covers a decent chunk of this part of the book too. Is actually pretty cool to kind of read that. So he says right off the bat what the prosecution's case relied on. So I know this kind of will answer some of the questions that some of you had in the chat earlier. So he says the prosecution's case relied on 1 hair, 2 stains, evidence of chloroform, and the smell of death in Casey's Pontiac fire to prove Casey put Kaylee's body in the trunk. all of the evidence here would only be admissible at trial under the Fry versus the United States case citing. So he goes through, again, all of that in example. And he flat out says, I had the inevitable task of holding numerous Fry hearings to determine the admissibility of the evidence, and then specifically goes through each piece of evidence. He realized that viewing his decision and ruling accordingly, again, could affect future cases, as we discussed. The judge then reviews the evidence, including the cadaver dogs, the smell from Casey's car trunk, and the garbage from the car as it relates to smell, because each thing was being questioned, like, should this be allowed in and why not? So let's see. We talked a little bit about how he had to break up case law for a lot of these going forward, whether it'd be allowed in or out. So one of the medical examiners that was known as Dr. G in this trial, and I'm going to totally butcher this last name, Dr. Garavaglia. So one of the things that the author says is, quote, the medical examiner, Dr. Garavaglia, also known as Dr. G, testified Kaylee's death was a homicide because of the delay in reporting her disappearance. The fact that the body was hidden in the existence of duct tape on her tiny body. However, under cross-examination, Dr. G admitted that she did not know the official cause of Kaylee's death. Ironically, Dr. G was supposed to be the state's key expert witness, but she helped the defense's argument. How could the jury convict someone for the murder of a child without knowing how that child died? End quote. I think that answers a lot of our kind of like type of moment in kind of question racking in our brain, right? And that's an excellent point that the author makes. That is an excellent point of what is being asked of the jury. So the closing arguments from both the state and the defense were discussed in length for both. So what the judge then says, kind of like as we read what the prosecution said in their closing, what the defense said in their closing. And it's not like verbatim transcript, but it's they put a pretty decent amount from each. So after that is said in the book, the judge says, quote, the prosecution made a strong case. I thought they showed enough evidence to sustain a guilty verdict for first-degree murder, but the jury did not believe it. Anything can happen in a trial. There are no slam dunks. While I was shocked at the verdict, I knew an acquittal was possible. I gave the defense credit for littering that case with as much reasonable doubt as possible, which good defense attorneys do, end quote. So I have a few more quotes here for the end of the book that I just thought were very telling, and I wanted to go over that with you because these were kind of like the types of moments in the book where I'm like, this is what I wanted. Like, this is why I read this book. This is like, again, just bits and pieces that are sprinkled throughout of like what really grabbed me and why I then like this book and want you guys to read it and enjoy it as well too, right? So let me get back to my place here. Okay. So the author says, although Casey appeared eligible for the death penalty on paper, the aggravating and mitigating factors suggested otherwise. Again, the state could not prove how the child died. The big mistake they made was seeking the death penalty, not because I believe Casey was innocent, but because jurors are more hesitant to sentence someone to death without absolute proof. Jurors have to be absolute certain the defendant is guilty before they sentence them to death. The author goes on to say, the state also made a mistake by not giving jurors the safety vow of being able to look at the lesser included offenses. They did not give jurors a special instruction on it, nor did they give them an argument saying, if you do not believe Casey committed murder 1, then this is why you should consider her guilty of murder 2. And that was one thing that I think a lot of us who watched that trial Again, we all have our feelings on it. Trust me, I am right there with you. But the jury only had an all or nothing. There was no in between. And I think when you take a step back, again, regardless of our feelings, and I'm speaking for myself in that, right? Because I've been very outspoken on my thoughts on Casey Anthony. And when you take a step back and you're like, here's what the jury had to work with, it makes sense. It sucks, but it made sense. So what was the prosecutor, male or female? Well, it was a team. So technically the answer is both, but the lead prosecutor was male. And actually, Tony, we are going to, did I have that in my notes here? I know I talked about it. No, I don't have it in my notes here. I talked about it in Jose Baez's book review, Presumed Guilty. The lead prosecutor, and the judge does talk about it briefly in here, but since it was discussed on my other book review, I was like, not worth double mentioning it. But since you brought it up, I will say the lead prosecutor, he would very frequently make very expressive facial reactions when the defense was either speaking or cross-examining someone or just regular examining their own witnesses. And it was being picked up by the cameras and put out in the media. So the thing is, if this is all being seen by people on the outside, the jury was seeing this too. And the judge says that this happens a lot during closing arguments. Like, it just came to a head because it became like out of control the way the lead prosecutor was. And the judge says that when Jose Baez brought it to his attention of like, no, here's what's happening, the judge was like, well, I had no view of, lead counsel for the state because your poster board is like blocking my view. It was caught on camera, the way the lead prosecutor was making these like facial reactions were just completely inappropriate to do during court because, again, the jury's seeing that. And the footage was shown to the judge. And I will say the judge, and again, it was talked about in Jose Baez's book, the judge was just like, oh, did you do this? And like kind of dressed down the state prosecutor, where he had to kind of like, well, and then the judge is like, no, answer the question, and made him kind of realize what he was doing. But I thought the judge, for a no-nonsense judge, I thought he could have been harsher on the lead prosecutor because he knows better. I did think when the judge says in his book that like it was brought to his attention and he saw for himself, it was just kind of like, slap on the wrist, don't do that. And it's like, well, wait a minute. But that's just kind of how I took it. But that does get addressed in this book. So to answer your long story short, to answer your question, the lead prosecutor was male. I'm blanking his name, but it's in this book. And I know the second I like finish my live and like closing my laptop, I'll be like, oh, right, that was his name. So, all right. So while the author also goes to talk about, and we're just kind of wrapping this up, right? While Jose Baez may quote, and this kind of actually goes to what I'm saying. While Jose Baez may have felt I favored one side over the other, that is the furthest thing from reality. It is only natural for attorneys, whether the court rules for or against them, to believe judges favor one side over the other, when in fact, the only thing I did was apply the law in my ruling. My job was to call the balls and strikes, and that is what I did to the best of my ability, end quote. I will say again, just there were a few moments where I'm like, I think he was a little soft on certain things. But again, when he says right in that statement, to the best of my ability, like what argument do I have, right? And at the end of the day, who am I to even argue that? I know you have, Tony Stewart, and I'm very impressed. Very, very impressed. So y'all remember that Peacock docuseries that came out maybe last year or the year before? Yeah, because we're 2026 now. So last year or the year before. Well, the judge talks about that in this book. And he does not hold back. He does not hold back. Quote, in my opinion, what Casey says in the new Peacock docuseries is the same crap she floated during the trial. During the trial, she claimed the child somehow slipped out of the home and drowned in the pool. George retrieved the child, brought her into the house, and dumped the child in a swampy area like a piece of trash. I was unmoved by Casey's portrayal of herself as a victim. She has bad things happen to her. So should we let it go if she has anything happen to her daughter? She does not answer any of those age-old questions. Who killed Kaylee? How did the child die? Who put her body in the woods? It is almost like she wants people to feel sorry for her because she was molested, which spotlights her as the victim instead of the true victim of her story, Kaylee. My theory is that Casey used chloroform to sedate Kaylee, but she gave her too much and panicked, later dumping the child in the swamp, end quote. Let me repeat that last sentence. The judge is flat out saying in his book, quote, my theory is that Casey used chloroform to sedate Kaylee, but she gave her too much and panicked, later dumping the child in the swamp, end quote. When I got to that part in the book, and it's way late in the book, I was just like, this is what I wanted. This is why I read this whole book. Because again, the judge, saw everything, heard everything. We, as the people who observed the trial and the media reporting on it, there were things that were excluded from being presented that we will never hear and we will never see. The judge saw it all. The judge heard it all. And that was his takeaway from everything. So, but we are not done. Just a couple quick more points. Although I could just leave you there. But no. There's a little bit more. So he goes on to say, it's just like, he's just like, all right, I'm not letting Casey in this Peacock docuseries just say what she wants. Like, he's just like picking apart things she said. And I'm like, I'm right. I'm here for it, Judge. I am here. So he goes on to say, almost like quoting Casey from the docuseries, I was awoken by my father shaking me and asking where Kaylee was. And he says, that just didn't make sense. She would never have left. What Casey's saying is she's and Kaylee would never have left the room without telling her first. So Casey, saying, I immediately started looking around the house. I go outside and I'm looking to see where could she be. And Casey then says, well, I followed my father outside to where he was holding Kaylee's body wrapped in a towel. Casey also, in this docuseries, wonders whether George had, could he have moved on to start sexually abusing Kaylee? Maybe he staged the drowning after he accidentally smothered Kaylee with a pillow during an alleged sexual attack. Quote, there are too many scenarios of what could have happened, end quote, Casey says. The judge says, but her drowning in the pool is not one. It's not possible. It's not still something I can't piece together. Casey then goes on to say, quote, but I wasn't the only one home. I'm not outright accusing him of murder, but it wasn't an accident in the pool, end quote. So again, we have the judge kind of saying, Casey's saying this, it's not possible. Here's why. She goes on to say this again, not possible. So Casey, again, in this docuseries, saying it's impossible for the 2-year-old to scale the sides of the above ground pool without assistance. There was no ladder, no way for her to shimmy up, no way to explain that unless George, her dad, put her in the pool to cover up what he did. So as we know from the opening statements, Casey claimed her daughter drowned in the pool that day. And so for those 31 days, yes, she was out partying and doing X, Y, and Z, and she wasn't looking for Kaylee because she knew Kaylee was not missing. So the entire defense was based on that theory. But in this docuseries, the judge is like, wait a minute. All this time has passed, and she's now saying in this docuseries new information. Now she says the pool was too high up for Kaylee to climb in. So the new story is that George murdered Kaylee, then put Kaylee in the pool to make it look like she drowned. This is what really happened. So the judge takes a step back and goes, let's look at that statement. That either means the defense was lying under oath or Casey is lying now. Which claim is true? Which one is believable? So the judge goes on to say, as a capital murder judge, I was given the power to start the mechanism of death. And I'm like, oh, I love that quote. I love that quote. He says, with great power comes great responsibility. I need to dot all the T's. Oh my God. Dot all the I's and cross all the T's. I knew the second I read that because I messed up in my notes. I'm like, I'm going to get it wrong. Dot all the I's and cross all the T's to ensure that the sentences were proper and the crimes committed and the defendants that he sentenced to death were fairly judged. And he says, quote, being a judge was a lonely walk. A judge has a sixth sense, a gut feeling of the right thing to do. People do not realize the responsibility of a chief judge, end quote. So the very, very end of the book, and I'm actually going to read you guys the very ending paragraph. It abruptly ends with this. And I do not like the ending. I just felt like there were so many paragraphs in like the last several pages of the book where like he could have just ended it there and it would have like wrapped it up very, very nicely. But he doesn't do that. This is the last part of the book. My best friend was a German Shepherd named Bosco. Unfortunately, I had to put him to sleep when he was 13 years old, but I'm paying tribute to him in this book. When I finally hang my legal hat up for good, I will still keep busy, but I'm looking forward to those days when I can wake up and have nothing to do. End quote. I'm like, wait, what? I see where the author was going. I just think the ending paragraph was very poorly executed because there's so many great writing moments in this book that the end, there was just so many other options that could have been more effective. Again, still a great book, but like that ending thing where you just end on that note where you're like, wow, totally dropped the ball. Totally dropped the ball. Which is sad because I don't like saying that, but I gotta call it. Right? So that is my kind of overall review of the book, The Velvet Hammer by Chief Judge Belvin Perry Jr. and Amy Mitchell. So again, overall takes. I liked the book. I would recommend it to everybody to read. It does a great job in explaining things that only the judge perspective can give, not just in the Casey Anthony trial, but in so many of the other cases that he represented, but then also just in regards to being informative and giving information to the reader in a very clear way that anybody can read this and follow along. Excellent. Excellently done. In regards to a lot of the other cases that he touched upon, again, some of the cases that he focused on, he gave several pages to, some that were referenced or maybe like a paragraph. I loved those part of the books. I would have loved to have gotten more from those, especially the ones where we only gave like a paragraph because they were just so interesting. And I'm like, oh, I would like more as a reader. But with that being said, it gives it so the reader can kind of read a little bit about each of these cases and be like, oh, gee, that's too violent for me, or oh, that doesn't interest me for whatever reason, and then move on. Or if you're like, wait a minute, that case sounds really fascinating, I would like to learn more about it. It gives you that moment to kind of pause where you're reading and do like a little Google search or something and learn more about all these other cases, which is pretty cool. In regards to the narrative and structure of the book, like I mentioned, he will kind of jump to the present time, semi-present time, and then jump back, and then jump ahead a little bit forward, and then jump back, but not as far back as before, and so on and so forth. Ooh, almost knocked that over. I don't care for that type of structure, but with that being said, he does do it in a very effective way where it was more seamlessly done than other books I have read. So I will give him that. Again, there are no pictures in this book, which is fine with me. I would have definitely not wanted to see any pictures of Casey Anthony because that's a big chunk of what this book is about. I would have liked to have seen pictures of the judge and him growing up or him on the bench, so on and so forth, but the book doesn't give that. So there's that. Again, in regards to the book, like I just mentioned, with most of it being about Casey Anthony, a large part, I would say about 60% is about Casey Anthony and the murder of Kaylee in the trial. I felt it gave way more than what I thought it would, way more than I think is necessary. But at the end of the day, that is what's going to grab a lot of readers. And I get that, and I respect that. I did not like where the judge referenced so much of Jose Baez's book. I felt as the parts about Casey Anthony were going on, and you can see like at the bottom of the pages where he's referencing that book again and again and again. I'm just thinking like, we know I don't need Jose Baez's perspective. We want your perspective as the judge in the case. That's why I'm reading this book. I would have just liked more of his perspective. I mean, don't get me wrong, the book does give a lot of that. I just would have taken Jose's out completely. So I didn't think it was needed. Other than that, excellent book. Overall, great read. Why I came across this book, I heard the author give an interview on, oh gosh, what is it? I'm totally blanking the podcast, and I have one actually loaded right here to listen to my drive for work. I can't believe I'm blanking it because True Murder. I was thinking True Crime. I'm like, no podcast is just called True Crime. True Murder with Dan Zupansky. So that is one of my favorite podcasts. I've actually recommended it like way back years ago when I did like, what are my favorite podcasts right now? True Murder with Dan Zupansky. Every single week, he has an author of a new true crime book that comes out on his show. This podcast is responsible for, I cannot tell you how many books that I bought, but that's how I came across this book. Is Chief Judge Belvin was on that podcast when this book came out and talked about it, and I was like, oh my gosh, this sounds absolutely fascinating. I have to get this book. So I've had this book for a little bit and finally got around to reading it and sharing with you guys. But that's kind of how it came across my radar. And yeah, that is just, I know I'm a book nerd and we talk about so many true crime books on this channel. But if y'all are into like listening to podcasts and getting even more book reviews or book, recommendations, hands down, download that podcast. I'm telling you right now. So, all right, folks, let me just do a quick look back at the chat and then we will kind of wind it down for tonight. Tony Stewart, I believe dark days for Casey Anthony are ahead. I mean, she was just recently, a month or two ago in New Hampshire on some date, pictured. I'm thinking, oh God, you were too close to my state for comfort. But I don't think he did. I don't think that he had a soft spot for Casey. That was not my take on it, at least. Michael Myers. We'll leave that one there, hun. Yeah, no, I think you and maybe others would like to have seen that, but yeah, no, the judge is too polite to say that. Thank you, Wolf. Thank you so much. These book reviews really, you mean, aren't that bad at all. Dang, I should start paying more attention. I mean, Tony Stewart, you know what? But you're here on time as always, and I love that. If I recall correctly, Casey had Google search. Yes, she did. Yep, and that was talked about too in the kind of beginning part, Wolf, of the Casey Anthony section in regards to the time frame. So again, I didn't go over that because I'm we don't need to go over the Casey Anthony case, but it does talk about, she's saying that, her mom said goodbye in the morning at this time and left, and Casey's saying she slept in with her daughter until this time. However, Google searches showed, at this time she was on her, MySpace or something like that. It does get into specifically what site she was on and what she was looking for and to the minute at what time, which is, again, a lie from what she told police. Shocking. And yes, the book does get into how she was walking police officers through Disney, waving at, oh yeah, these are my coworkers. Oh God, we know. So yeah, that is that everyone. So if you have read the book, leave a comment, let me know. I would love to hear your take on it. If there was something that you took away from it that really was impactful or stood out, or something that you were like, oh, I couldn't stand this section and here's why. Let me know. If you take away from this review that you're like, hey, I was interested in picking up that book and, maybe, yeah, not my cup of tea and good to know, leave that comment. Or if you're like, you know what, I was on the fence and now I'm going to be picking up that book, leave that as well. I really love the engagement with you guys in regards to where we all stand with these books. Because I just like to bounce a lot of this off of you guys. Some of you, who read it at the same time and either have a different takeaway or, those moments where you're like, did you read this? Oh my God, I know. Those oh my God moments. When you have those, when you're reading something at the same time as somebody else, wild, just wild. So yeah, that's that. So thank you everybody again for joining me tonight for this review. And again, The Velvet Hammer by Chief Judge Belvin Perry Jr. and Amy Mitchell. Check it out. No true crime and chill at the end of this week. I will be back early next week with a show for you guys. So everybody have a great rest of your evening and a great rest of your week. Remember, until next time, we don't live in darkness. Darkness lives in us. Bye, everyone.